Don't go to the bathroom during your soul's life review. You might miss the best part, by David Russo. What if the life review isn't as serious as we imagine? Imagine your earthly life is complete, and now comes the great soul review. Everything is there. Your successes, failures, relationships, arguments, embarrassing moments, acts of kindness, wrong turns, lucky breaks, and all those times you thought you knew exactly what you were doing when you really didn't. Then, just as the review reaches an important moment, you decide to go to the bathroom. Of course, if you're a soul, you probably don't need a bathroom anymore, which makes the whole idea a little ridiculous. But that's the point. We often imagine a life review as an incredibly serious event when, in one sense, you already know the story because you lived it. Maybe the great surprise wouldn't be discovering what you did. Maybe it would be finally understanding what it all meant. And perhaps thinking about that possibility can teach us something while we're still here. Take responsibility for your life, certainly, but don't take every scene so seriously that you forget to enjoy the movie. Introduction. You've already seen this movie. If some form of life review exists after death, there is something fascinating about the idea of watching a story in which you already know every major event. You know who you loved, you know where you worked, you know the opportunities you took and the ones you missed. You remember at least some of the mistakes, victories, arguments, surprises, heartbreaks, and beautiful moments. There shouldn't be many spoilers because you were the main character. Yet seeing the entire story at once might be completely different from experiencing it one day at a time. That is the perspective we will explore throughout this audiobook. This isn't a claim that we know exactly what happens after death or that a literal life review awaits us. Instead, the soul review becomes a thought experiment, a way of stepping outside our present lives and looking back from an imagined, wider perspective. What might seem important from there? What might suddenly seem almost comical? What might we wish we had worried about less? And most importantly, if we could borrow some of that perspective now, could we live the remaining chapters of our lives with greater awareness, compassion, humor, and appreciation? Chapter 1. The Ultimate Replay. Imagine watching your entire lifetime from beginning to end, not as an old collection of photographs or memories, but as one complete story. You see childhood, adolescence, adulthood, relationships, work, dreams, disappointments, celebrations, and the thousands of ordinary days connecting everything together. While living those moments, you could only experience them one at a time. In a life review, perhaps the remarkable difference would be seeing how they all connect. That could completely change the meaning of certain events. Something you once considered a disaster might appear as a turning point. The job you didn't get may have pushed you toward another opportunity. A relationship that ended may have changed how you eventually learned to love. An embarrassing failure might have given you humility that later helped you understand another person. We normally judge events while standing in the middle of them, without knowing where they will eventually lead. Perhaps that is what would make the ultimate replay fascinating. It wouldn't simply show you what happened. It might show you how one event flowed into another. Suddenly, the random pieces could begin forming a picture. And if that possibility has any value for us today, perhaps it is this. When something doesn't make sense yet, we don't necessarily have to declare it meaningless. We haven't finished watching the story. Hello, this is David Russo. I was watching a movie once and I had to go to the bathroom. I knew the movie was almost over, so I waited. I wanted to see the ending. And then, of course, I went to the bathroom. It makes me think about the idea of a soul life review. In one sense, it might be a been there, done that experience. After all, it's your life. You already lived it. You know the main story, but there could be angles you never saw while you were living it. Deeper understandings, answers to questions you've carried with you, the effects you had on other people, and maybe even some of those what-ifs you've wondered about for years. But I think there's a deeper lesson here. Maybe we don't have to approach the idea of a life review with so much seriousness or fear. Maybe we can take it a little more lightly. And if we can imagine looking back on our entire lives someday with greater understanding and perspective, maybe we can bring some of that perspective into our lives right now. Live responsibly, learn from what happens, but don't take every scene so seriously that you forget to enjoy the movie. Chapter 2. There are no spoilers. There is an amusing contradiction in being afraid of seeing your own life reviewed. Who exactly is going to surprise you with the information? Imagine someone announcing dramatically, "Now we're going to show you what you did when you were 37. You might answer, "I know, I was there." Every mistake being shown belongs to the same person watching the review. Every questionable decision, awkward conversation, and missed opportunity is already part of your history. But knowing an event happened and understanding it are two very different things. You may remember an argument but never have understood what the other person was feeling. You may remember helping someone without realizing how important your kindness became to them. You might remember losing an opportunity without knowing that its disappearance redirected your entire life. The events themselves might contain no surprises, while their consequences contain many. That changes the soul review from a frightening unveiling into something more interesting. Perhaps the question isn't, what will they show me? But, what will I finally understand? Instead of fearing the footage, imagine becoming curious about it. You know the scenes, you simply haven't seen them yet from every possible angle. Chapter 3. You might be taking the movie too seriously. Think about something that deeply worried you 10 or 20 years ago. Maybe you couldn't sleep because of it. Perhaps you replayed it constantly in your mind and wondered how you would ever get through it. Now ask yourself how often you think about it today. Some problems remain significant, of course, but others that once seemed enormous have become tiny footnotes in the larger story of your life. That should tell us something about perspective. When we're standing inside a difficult moment, that moment can occupy our entire field of vision. It becomes the movie instead of one scene in the movie. We cannot see the next chapter because it hasn't happened yet. But time eventually provides distance, and distance frequently changes meaning. What looked permanent becomes temporary. What felt catastrophic becomes manageable. Sometimes what looked like an ending turns out to have been a beginning. Imagine multiplying that perspective across an entire lifetime. Perhaps a soul review would reveal how much energy we spent worrying about scenes that lasted only a few minutes in the full story. That doesn't mean we should become careless or indifferent. It means we can care deeply without assuming every problem is the final verdict on our lives. Sometimes it's just a difficult scene. Keep watching. Chapter 4. The scenes you wish you could skip. Every life contains scenes we'd rather not watch again. Maybe you hurt someone. Maybe someone hurt you. Perhaps you made a foolish decision when you should have known better. There may be moments that still produce embarrassment years later. If we imagine a soul review, These might be exactly the scenes we'd want to fast forward through. I've seen enough of this one. Can we move ahead? But perhaps those scenes would become some of the most revealing. A mistake seen only as a mistake can produce shame. A mistake understood within the larger story can produce wisdom. You might see what fear influenced you, what you didn't understand at the time, how another person experienced your actions, and what changed within you afterward. Understanding doesn't erase responsibility. It gives responsibility somewhere productive to go. Maybe you wouldn't leave the review hating the person you used to be. You might understand that person better. You could recognize where you failed while also seeing how you grew. If so, we don't necessarily have to wait for some future spiritual perspective to begin doing that. We can acknowledge what we did, repair what can be repaired, learn what can be learned, and stop demanding that yesterday becomes something other than yesterday. Chapter 5. The parts you didn't know were important. If someone asks you to identify the most important moments of your life, you might naturally choose the obvious milestones: graduation, marriage, children, career achievements, major losses, major successes, or life-changing decisions. But a soul review might contain surprises precisely because importance isn't always obvious while something is happening. The moment that meant almost nothing to you may have meant everything to somebody else. Maybe you encouraged someone on a day when they were ready to give up. Perhaps you treated a stranger kindly when that person desperately needed kindness. You may have taught a child something you didn't even remember saying. Someone could have watched how you handled a difficult situation and carried that example forward for years. Human beings affect one another constantly, often without receiving any report about what happened afterward. What if some of the best parts of your review are scenes you barely remember? That possibility changes how we look at ordinary life. You don't always know when you're participating in an important moment. There isn't necessarily dramatic music playing in the background to alert you. Sometimes the meaningful scene looks completely ordinary while it's happening. Chapter 6. Seeing yourself through other people's eyes. One fascinating possibility sometimes associated with spiritual ideas about life reviews is that we might somehow understand the effects our actions had on other people. We cannot know whether this actually happens, but as a thought experiment, it is powerful. Imagine seeing an argument not only through your eyes, but through the eyes of the person standing across from you. Suddenly, experiences you thought you understood might become more complicated. You could discover that a comment you barely remembered stayed with someone for years. You might realize that a kindness you considered insignificant arrived at exactly the right moment. You might understand why someone reacted in a way that once confused you. And perhaps you would also discover occasions when people loved, respected, or appreciated you without ever telling you. Seen this way, the review wouldn't merely be about evaluating an isolated individual. It would reveal relationships. Our lives constantly overlap with other lives, and every interaction creates something between us. If imagining that future perspective encourages us to listen more carefully, apologize when necessary, express appreciation, and offer kindness now, then the idea of a soul review has already accomplished something useful. Chapter 7. Maybe you are harder on yourself than anyone else. Imagine meeting yourself at 10 years old. Now imagine meeting yourself at 18, 25, 40, or whatever earlier age feels meaningful to you. You know things today that those versions of you couldn't possibly have known. Would you stand over them, listing every mistake they were going to make? Or would you recognize that they were doing the best they could with the awareness, experience, fears, and circumstances they had at the time? We often judge our past selves using information acquired only after the decisions were made. We say, I should have known, even when the reason we know today is because the experience taught us. That doesn't excuse harmful behavior or eliminate accountability. It simply recognizes that growth requires there to have been an earlier version of us who hadn't grown yet. Perhaps the wider perspective of a soul review would include compassion for every version of ourselves. You might look at the younger you and finally understand what the person was trying to do. Maybe one of the lessons wouldn't be how badly you failed, but how unnecessarily harshly you judged yourself afterward. You can begin changing that relationship now. Chapter 8, the comedy reel. Surely an entire human lifetime would contain some comedy. Think about how seriously we sometimes take awkward situations. We say the wrong thing, walk into the wrong room, misunderstand someone's intentions, become angry over something ridiculous, or spend hours preparing for a disaster that never occurs. At the time, we may feel humiliated. Years later, we're retelling the story at dinner and everyone is laughing, including us. Humor is often perspective arriving through another door. Nothing about the original event changed. What changed was our distance from it. The ego that once screamed, "This is terrible," eventually relaxed enough to say, "That was actually pretty funny." Imagine seeing decades of these moments together. Your life review might contain a surprisingly entertaining comedy reel. Perhaps spirituality doesn't always have to appear solemn. Maybe wisdom sometimes includes being able to laugh lovingly at the human character we played. We took ourselves seriously because being human felt serious from the inside, but occasionally we can loosen our grip. If you spilled the coffee, forgot someone's name, made a harmless fool of yourself, or had a bad day, perhaps it doesn't need to become a permanent chapter in the tragedy of your existence. Chapter 9. Don't go to the bathroom yet. Now we arrive at the title. Your soul review is playing, and suddenly you decide it's time for a bathroom break. Of course, this raises an obvious question. Why would a soul need to go to the bathroom? Apparently, we have carried earthly habits into the afterlife. You return and ask, "Did I miss anything?" And somebody replies, "Only the best part." The ridiculous image contains a serious idea. During difficult periods of life, we sometimes mentally check out. We assume nothing good can come from this chapter. We want to fast forward through grief, uncertainty, disappointment, waiting, or failure. Yet we cannot always know what the difficult scene is connected to. Something happening today might be preparing us for something we cannot yet see. So perhaps the message is, don't leave the theater too quickly. Don't decide the movie is terrible because you don't like the current scene. Life changes, circumstances change, you change. There may be another character about to walk through the door, another opportunity you haven't imagined, another realization waiting to occur. You don't want to come back asking, "What did I miss?" Chapter 10. You're still filming the movie. There is one enormous difference between imagining your future soul review and actually having it. Right now, the movie isn't finished. You are still making it. Whatever happened yesterday is already part of the footage, but today's scene remains open. That makes the life review idea less about obsessing over the past and more about becoming conscious of the present. You cannot return to a conversation from 20 years ago and replace your words. But perhaps you can have a better conversation today. You cannot take an opportunity you rejected years ago, but you can become more willing to recognize the next one. You cannot erase every mistake, but you can allow the wisdom gained from those mistakes to influence what you do next. The story continues. Imagine occasionally asking yourself, when I look back on today, what will I be glad I did? Maybe you'll make the phone call. Maybe you'll forgive somebody. Maybe you'll begin the project you've postponed. Maybe you'll simply put down your worries long enough to enjoy dinner with someone you love. You are simultaneously the character and, to some extent, the director of what happens next. Chapter 11. Take life seriously, but not too seriously. There is an important distinction between saying, don't take life too seriously, and saying, nothing matters. Our actions matter. How we treat people matters. Our commitments matters. Love matters. Responsibility matters. If anything, imagining a life review might make those things seem even more important because we could eventually see their effects more clearly. But importance doesn't require constant anxiety. You can care about your career without believing one bad day destroys your future. You can care about relationships without expecting yourself or everyone around you to be perfect. You can pursue goals while accepting setbacks. You can take responsibility for mistakes without making those mistakes your permanent identity. Maybe one mark of wisdom is learning what deserves our seriousness. Hurting someone deserves reflection. A harmless, embarrassing moment probably doesn't deserve 15 years of mental replay. Loving someone deserves your attention. Someone else's casual opinion about you may not. The more clearly we distinguish what matters from what merely feels urgent, the lighter and more meaningful life can become. Chapter 12. Don't miss the best part. When we hear the phrase, the best part, we naturally imagine something dramatic. Maybe it's the greatest accomplishment of your life or a spectacular experience still waiting in the future. But what if the best scenes in a soul review aren't necessarily spectacular? Perhaps they're remarkably ordinary. Maybe you see yourself laughing with someone who is no longer here. Perhaps it's sitting at a kitchen table, walking with a friend, holding someone's hand, playing with your children, talking with your parents, watching a sunset, or enjoying a quiet morning when nothing particularly important seemed to be happening. You may have rushed through some of these moments because you were thinking about what came next. That might be one of the greatest surprises of looking back at an entire lifetime. We spend so much time waiting for life to happen that we can overlook the fact that it is happening. Maybe the best part isn't a single scene at all. Maybe it is recognizing how extraordinary it was to have all these ordinary moments. Don't miss them while you're here. Conclusion. Enjoy the movie while you're still in it. If there is someday a soul life review, perhaps you'll watch the strange, beautiful, frustrating, hilarious story of being you. You'll see things you got right and things you got spectacularly wrong. You'll revisit people you loved, people who challenged you, opportunities you accepted, opportunities you missed, and countless ordinary moments you had forgotten. And perhaps with the entire story finally visible, you'll understand connections that were impossible to recognize while you were living one day at a time. Maybe you'll also notice how seriously you took certain scenes. You worried about what people thought. You imagined disasters that never arrived. You replayed mistakes long after everyone else had forgotten them. You sometimes treated temporary problems as permanent conditions. Yet the movie continued. New people appeared. Circumstances changed. You learned, adjusted, failed, succeeded, loved, laughed, struggled, and continued becoming someone you couldn't have imagined at the beginning. You don't wait for a hypothetical soul review to gain some of that perspective. You take responsibility for your life, but leave room for humor. Learn from mistakes without living inside them. Tell people you love them while they're still part of the current scene. Notice the ordinary moments before they become precious memories. And if someday your soul really does sit down to watch the entire story again, stay in your seat. You already know how the movie ends. What you may not know yet is which part will turn out to have been the best.